History is often written in fire and iron. We expect the end of an empire to sound like the shattering of timber, the scream of the horse, and the roar of the victor. But for the greatest city the ancient world had ever seen, the end did not sound like a battle. It sounded like a whisper. It is the night of October 12th, 539 BCE. Inside the walls of Babylon, the air is thick with the scent of roasted lamb, spilled wine, and the heavy, floral musk of nard oil. Belshazzar, the prince regent, sits upon a throne of cedar and gold. Before him, 1,000 lords drink from silver vessels, treasures looted from the Temple of Jerusalem decades prior. They believe they are safe. They believe they are eternal. The walls of Babylon, the Imjer Enlil, are 40 feet thick and nearly 100 feet high. They are a mountain of brick that has never been climbed. But outside, in the suffocating dark of the Mesopotamian night, the impossible is happening. The Euphrates River, the very soul of the city, the water that flows directly through its heart, is vanishing. Popular myth tells us that great cities fall to superior arms or the treachery of a broken gate. We imagine the Persian king, Cyrus the Great, standing at the head of a thundering cavalry charge. We are wrong. The fall of Babylon was not a feat of arms, but a masterpiece of engineering. 10 miles upstream, 10,000 Persian laborers have spent the last 48 hours digging in the red earth, carving a massive canal into the desert. They are not attacking the city. They are redirecting the planet. As the moon eclipses, the water level beneath the massive bronze river gates drops, inch by inch, foot by foot. The liquid barrier that protected the Golden City for centuries is sucked into the thirsty sands, leaving behind a highway of stinking mud. By the time the first Persian scout steps onto the riverbed, his sandals sinking into the silt where the current should have been, the fate of the Near East is sealed. This is the story of a civilization that became so obsessed with its own divinity that it forgot the ground beneath its feet. This is the story of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, a kingdom of astronomers and architects, of poets and tyrants, whose fall proved that even the most fortified heart can stop beating if you simply drain the blood. We do not just recount the fall of the Golden City, we resurrect the memory of the first world's end. This is Babylon, the blood of the Golden City. To understand Babylon, you must first understand the mud. In the southern cradle of Mesopotamia, there is no timber, there is no marble, there is no natural stone. There is only the silt, deposited by the twin serpents, the Tigris and the Euphrates. This is a landscape of extremes. In the summer, the temperature regularly screams past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. In the spring, the rivers swell with the snowmelt of the Taurus Mountains, threatening to wash away everything in their path. The people who settled here 5,000 years ago could not simply survive. They had to dominate the water. They became the world's first masters of hydraulic engineering, carving a network of thousands of miles of canals that turned a salt-crusted desert into a lush, emerald garden of barley and date palms. Because the land was flat and featureless, the Babylonian mind became obsessed with the vertical. If the earth gave them nothing but mud, they would bake that mud into bricks and build their own mountains. they would reach for the stars, because there was nothing else on the horizon to look at. By the time our story begins in the 7th century BCE, Babylon was already ancient. It was a city of ghosts. 2,000 years before Belshazzar, the great Hammurabi had turned this city into the legal and cultural center of the world. But history is a cycle of crushing weight. For centuries, the Babylonians lived under the iron shadow of the Assyrians, the Romans of the East, whose capital, Nineveh, was a fortress of terror and military perfection. For 300 years, Babylon was the rebellious daughter of the Assyrian Empire. It was sacked, its temples were burned, its people were deported. But the memory of its former glory never dissolved in the river Silt. It waited for a spark. That spark arrived in 626 BCE with a man named Nabopolassar. A county-in-chieftain of immense ambition, he seized the throne during a period of Assyrian civil unrest. But he did not act alone. He forged an alliance with the Medes, a rising power from the Arabian plateau. Together, they did the unthinkable. In 612 BCE, they marched on Nineveh. They didn't just defeat the Assyrians, they erased them. They diverted the Kosa River to undermine Nineveh's walls, a tactic that would ironically echo in Babylon's own end. The fall of the Assyrian Empire was the greatest geopolitical earthquake in history to that point. From the ashes of the Old World, Nabopolassar birthed the Neo-Babylonian Empire. He spent the rest of his reign until his death in 605 BCE, laying the foundation for a city that would not just be a capital, but a cosmic statement. He began the reconstruction of the Etemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, a ziggurat rising nearly 300 feet into the air. He wasn't just building a temple, he was declaring that the Mesopotamian soul had been resurrected. When he died, he left this burgeoning superpower to his son, a man whose name would become synonymous with both architectural brilliance and biblical terror: Nebuchadnezzar II. To rule the world, one must first feed the world. Babylon was not sustained by gold, but by the relentless mathematical optimization of the Mesopotamian soil. The Neo-Babylonian economy was a marvel of caloric logistics. The empire was powered by two primary engines, the barley field and the date palm. A single acre of irrigated Babylonian soil could produce nearly 3,000 pounds of grain, a yield 3 times higher than that of the Iron Age Greeks. At its peak, Babylon housed over 200,000 souls. To feed a city of this magnitude, the empire managed a fleet of over 5,000 flat-bottomed river barges. These vessels, constructed of reeds and coated in thick bitumen to keep them watertight, moved 20 tons of cargo at a time, drifting downstream with the current of the Euphrates. But the true genius lay in the Ejibi family, the world's first recorded multinational banking house. They didn't just trade goods, they traded risk. They managed estates, issued loans with interest rates fixed at 20% for silver and 33% for grain, and pioneered the use of clay tablets as promissory notes. This was the internet of the ancient world. If the economy was the lifeblood, the walls were the skeleton. In the ancient world, there were cities with walls, and then there was Babylon. The Imgur Enlil was not a wall, it was a psychological weapon made of brick. Nebuchadnezzar II transformed the city into a literal island of stone. The fortification system consisted of 3 concentric rings. The innermost wall was 21 feet thick. Beyond that stood the main wall, nearly 40 feet thick and soaring 80 feet into the air. But the engineering masterpiece was the outer casing, a wall of kiln-fired bricks bonded with bitumen, a natural asphalt that made the barrier waterproof and nearly indestructible to rams. Between these walls lay a military road, wide enough for 2 4-horse chariots to pass each other at full gallop. Calculations suggest that the construction of this 15-mile perimeter required over 400 million bricks. This was a logistical feat that dwarfed the Great Pyramid. To an approaching enemy, the city didn't look like a target. It looked like a geological formation. It was a fortress that assumed it could never be taken by force. Babylonian military physics focused on defensive superiority. Their elite units, the Sab-Shari, were equipped with the composite bow. This bow could generate a draw weight of 100 pounds, launching bronze-tipped arrows with enough kinetic energy to pierce leather armor at 200 yards. Their siege engines were monsters of engineering, massive wooden towers plated in iron to resist fire. They built for eternity. They calculated the weight of the water, the strength of the brick, and the arc of the arrow. They had mastered the hardware of empire. But as history would prove, even the strongest engine can be sabotaged by a failing spirit.
A city is more than its walls.
It is the story its people tell themselves to justify their existence. In Babylon, that story was written in the stars. The Babylonians' software, their culture and law, was a complex blend of extreme scientific rationalism and deep, terrified mysticism. At the center of the world stood the Etemenanki, the Tower of Babel of legend. To the Babylonians, this was not a monument to human pride, but a necessary anchor for the cosmos. Every year, during the Akitu festival, the king had to undergo a ritual of humiliation. He would be stripped of his regalia, his ears pulled, and his face slapped by the high priest of Marduk until he wept. If he did not cry, it was an omen that the gods were displeased. This was a society where even the most powerful man on earth was merely a tenant of the divine. While the rest of the world looked at the night sky with wonder, the Babylonians looked at it with a calculator. Their soft systems were built on the most advanced mathematics of antiquity, the sexagesimal, base 60 system. We live in their shadow every time we look at a clock. They divided the hour into 60 minutes and the circle into 360 degrees. This wasn't just for scholars, it was the framework for their reality. They tracked the 18.6-year cycle of the moon with a precision that would not be matched until the 18th century. They turned the chaos of the universe into an Excel spreadsheet of clay. Babylonian law was a refined evolution of Hammurabi's code. The Kidinu, the free citizens, enjoyed a status that felt almost modern. They were exempt from certain taxes and forced labor, and they possessed a charter of liberty that even the king was hesitant to violate. Women, too, occupied a space unique in the ancient world. They could own property, act as witnesses in court, and engage in trade independently. This social stability created a golden cage, a population that was incredibly productive and loyal as long as the grain flowed and the gods were honored. But this stability was fragile. By 550 BCE, that balance was beginning to tilt. The people began to care more for their rituals than their defenses, and their king, Nabonidus, began to care more for the moon than his people. We must not forget that Babylon was the world's first true melting pot. Because of the great deportations, the city was filled with displaced elites, the most famous being the Judean exiles. While the Bible remembers Babylon as a place of sorrow, the Al-Yahudu tablets show a different story. A vibrant, multi-ethnic middle class that was slowly being absorbed into the Babylonian dream. However, this diversity was a double-edged sword. When the Persians arrived at the gates, many of these Babylonians felt no loyalty to the crown. They were waiting for a liberator, not a martyr. History does not move in a straight line. It explodes. For Babylon, that explosion bore the name of Nebuchadnezzar II. The spring of 605 BCE witnessed a brutal changing of the guard for the ancient world. At the Battle of Carchemish, the young crown prince Nebuchadnezzar crushed the combined Egyptian forces, officially terminating the pharaoh's presence in the Near East. Merely months later, upon his father's death, Nebuchadnezzar ascended the throne, launching 2 decades of relentless expansion. By 597 BCE, he marched west, subjugating Jerusalem for the first time. But the most harrowing milestone came in 587 BCE. After an 18-month siege that left the city withered by starvation, Babylonian forces razed the Temple of Solomon and marched over 10,000 members of the Judean elite back to Babylon in chains. This was not merely an invasion, it was the systematic siphoning of neighboring nations' lifeblood to fuel a single, solitary center of power. Entering the decade of 580 BCE, the Ring of Swords was gradually replaced by the rhythmic strike of the stonemason's chisel. Nebuchadnezzar transitioned from a warrior into a great architect. For nearly the next 20 years, until his death in 562 BCE, Babylon underwent the most expensive facelift in history. Every year, the empire spent an estimated 200,000 kilograms of silver on public works. The Ishtar Gate, radiant with 575 symbols of dragons and bulls, was completed during this era, turning Babylon into a deep blue labyrinth of shimmering glazed bricks. However, this stability was a trap. When the army no longer fought, they became a ceremonial guard. When the elite became too preoccupied with consuming wealth, they forgot that a nation's strength lies in the edge of the sword, not the gilding of the brick. The death of Nebuchadnezzar in 562 BCE opened a chapter of pure chaos. In less than 6 years, the throne changed hands 3 times through a series of assassinations and coups. In 556 BCE, a scholar general named Nabonidus seized power, but he proved to be a strategic catastrophe. For a full decade, from 553 to 543 BCE, Nabonidus abandoned the capital to live in seclusion in the desert oasis of Tamar, leaving the kingdom in the hands of his inexperienced son, Belshazzar. Meanwhile, to the east, in 550 BCE, Cyrus the Great unified the Persian tribes, forging a massive war machine. In 547 BCE, Cyrus crossed the Tigris, wiping out Babylon's final allies. By the time Nabonidus rushed back to the capital in 540 BCE, he realized he had lost everything. A fractured populace, an economy crippled by inflation, and an enemy already standing at the foot of the city walls. In the final months of 539 BCE, Babylon was no longer an empire. It was merely a magnificent museum waiting for its new owner to arrive and clear the floor. Empires do not die from a single blow. They rot from the center outward until the skin is too thin to hold the weight of the bone. By the summer of 539 BCE, the structural rot of Babylon was no longer a secret. The internal fragmentation was driven by a religious civil war. King Nabonidus had committed the ultimate sacrilege. He had neglected Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, in favor of the moon god, Sin. To the powerful priesthood and the merchant elite, this wasn't just a theological shift, it was an economic disaster. The annual Akitu festival, which required the king's presence to legitimize the city's spiritual and financial contracts, had been cancelled for nearly a decade. The people felt abandoned by their gods and betrayed by their sovereign. When Cyrus the Great began his propaganda campaign, he didn't present himself as a conqueror. He presented himself as the true servant of Marduk, come to save Babylon from its own heretic king. The physical end began in September 539 BCE at the city of Opis, a strategic crossing on the Tigris. Nabonidus finally led his army out to meet the Persians. It was a slaughter. The Babylonian army was not just defeated, but liquidated. The Persians utilized a massive numerical advantage, roughly 150,000 men against 40,000, and superior mobility. But more importantly, the will to fight had evaporated. After the massacre at Opis, the city of Sippar surrendered without a fight on October 10th. The road to Babylon was now an open vein. On the night of October 12th, 539 BCE, while Prince Belshazzar feasted inside the palace, the Persian engineering corps executed their masterstroke. They didn't hammer at the walls. They diverted the Euphrates into a series of massive trenches and the nearby lake of Nitocris. In the space of a few hours, the water level dropped from several meters deep to the height of a man's thigh. The impenetrable river gates, designed to stop ships, were now hovering uselessly over a bed of stinking mud. The Persian immortals simply walked under the gates. There was no fire. There was no grand breach. The most famous city on earth was taken while its leaders were too drunk to notice the mud on the palace floors. The data of the fall is chilling in its efficiency. Casualties inside the city walls, near zero. Damage to infrastructure, non-existent. Cyrus entered the city on October 29th, 539 BCE, not as a destroyer, but as a liberator. The fragmentation was so complete that the Babylonians welcomed their conqueror with palm branches. The 70-year dream of the Neo-Babylonian Empire ended with a whimper, proving that once the social contract between a king and his people is broken, even the thickest walls in the world are nothing more than a pile of baked mud.
Babylon did not vanish.
It merely changed its state, from matter to mind. We do not walk its streets, but we live within the architecture of its logic every single day. The legacy of the Golden City is hard-coded into the DNA of modern civilization. When you look at a compass and see 360 degrees, you are using Babylonian geometry. When you look at your watch and see 60 minutes in an hour, you are honoring the sexagesimal mathematics of the astronomer priests who mapped the heavens from the top of the Etemenanki. They were the first to divide the circle of the sky into 12 signs, the zodiac, creating a celestial map that humanity has refused to redraw for over 2,000 years. Even the concept of the metropolis, the city as a sovereign, multicultural entity, was perfected here. Beyond the numbers, Babylon left us the template for the state. The Kadinu rights of its citizens were the distant ancestors of the Magna Carta, the idea that a citizen possesses a status that even a king must respect. Their literature, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the Enuma Elish, provided the narrative foundation for the mythologies of the West and the Near East alike. Even the Persians, who conquered them, were so entranced by Babylonian sophistication that they adopted their bureaucracy, their script, and their architectural style. Babylon was the teacher. The rest of the world was its student. But the most profound legacy of Babylon is a warning. It is the Ozymandias of the ancient world, a reminder that the greater the height, the more precarious the foundation. The fall of 539 BCE teaches us that power is an illusion if it is not matched by internal cohesion. You can build walls 40 feet thick. You can gild your gates in lapis lazuli. You can map the very stars. But if you lose the trust of your people, and if you forget to watch the river that sustains you, the end will not come with a roar. It will come as a soft, wet gurgle in the dark. Babylon fell because it believed it was eternal. It fell because it thought the river was a wall and not a highway. In the silence of the ruins, the ash tells us the truth. No empire is too big to fail. No city is too golden to burn. History is a mirror. If you found value in this resurrection of the past, join the Chronicle. Subscribe, comment with the civilization you wish to see resurrected next, and help us keep the flame of history alive against the encroaching dark. The empire is ash. The legacy remains. Until the next deep dive.